Hello and welcome to the Middle East Forum's webinar series, Israel Insider with Ashley Perry. I'm Stacey Roman and I will be moderating this discussion today. We are pleased to have Mr. Ashley Perry, advisor to the Middle East Forum's Israel office, join us here each Wednesday at 3 p.m. Eastern to update us on all the events going on in Israel. Mr. Perry will be giving us a briefing on current Israeli affairs for 15 minutes and open it up for questions. Should you wish to ask a question, please use the Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen to type out your question. And now, with no further ado, I'll turn the discussion over to Mr. Ashley Perry.
Thank you very much, Stacey, and good evening from Israel. There is a lot to talk about tonight, and domestic politics is certainly at the forefront of what's going on in Israel and what's going on with most Israelis, the thought process, what they expect. But I thought today we'd start a little bit more regionally. Since last week, we had the, not unexpected announcement that Morocco would normalize ties or, in some respect, even reforge ties, because there were some ties between Israel and Morocco after the Oslo process during the early 90s, but they ended as many other burgeoning ties did at the beginning of the Second Intifada, at the beginning around 2000, 2001. But this week, it turns out that Israel and Morocco are going to forge a new alliance. And again, like some of the other recent ones, it's not going to be just a cold peace, the likes of which Israel has enjoyed with Egypt since 1979 and Jordan 1994. The recent peace, normalization agreements for relations, whatever you want to call it, with the UAE, with Bahrain, Sudan, and now Morocco, of a different nature, at least with the UAE, to a large extent Bahrain, and it seems Morocco, that these are not just going to be sort of formal relations where we will have an embassy, they'll have an embassy, we will have ties just at the highest level. There's very little people-to-people ties with Egypt, with Jordan. In fact, there's a lot of antagonism, and probably majorities in both countries are against ties with Israel and certainly are highly critical. Some of the more recent normalization agreements or peace deals, if you want to refer to them that way, seem to be of a completely different nature. There does seem to be an interest in forging closer ties with Israel. As I talked last week, I myself came back from Dubai, where I walked around visibly Jewish, visibly even to a certain extent Israeli. There were people speaking Hebrew on the streets, and the locals that we encountered were extremely welcoming and said, please bring more people. And it seems that the Israelis have certainly picked up the gauntlet. There are expected to be something like 14,000 Israelis in the UAE over this month. Bahrain also a little bit behind, but still there's a lot of movement there. There are Bahraini senior officials in Israel recently. Sudan, obviously, that's a whole different sort of level. But even there, it does seem like there's an interest in forging greater ties. And it's not just about getting Sudan off the terrorist list, which is something that the Trump administration has done in the last few days. And now we see Morocco, and what's quite unexpected, I think, with Morocco, considering there is still a large contingent, perhaps even some sort of plurality against a normalization agreement in the country. We do see steps being taken to forge new alliances and greater understanding between the populations. We heard also this week that the Moroccan education system will teach about Jewish history, teach about the Jewish connection to Morocco. And that's, to a certain extent, what makes this particular deal quintessentially different for Israelis. What we've got to understand is out of 9 million Israelis, around 7 million of which are Jewish, at least 1 million have direct ties to Morocco. These are people who are 1 or 2 generations from Morocco. They still maintain very much Moroccan culture, food. Many of them will speak Arabic or French, and even some of them have ties in the country. Morocco is one of the few places in the Arab world that still maintains a Jewish community. It's a relatively small Jewish community, but it's one protected by the crown, by the king. It's one that has very good relations. There are events every year. which the Jewish community are invited to. There have been Jews who visit Morocco to visit the graves of rabbis, well-known rabbis or relatives. It is a place where a Jew can feel relatively free to go. So it was always one that was relatively friendly to Jews, definitely in respect to some of the other Arab countries. But as I said, I think for a lot of Israelis, this did feel a little bit different. Some Israeli ministers or Israeli members of Knesset with Moroccan ties welcomed this, especially some of them dressed up in Moroccan dress, and they really celebrated this as something a little bit different. This is closer to them, closer to their roots, closer to their culture. But what I think is happening, and this was the title of tonight's webinar, is does this signal the end of the Israeli-Arab conflict? As we know, the Israel-Palestinian conflict has been raging, or sort of the war against Jewish sovereignty in our ancestral and indigenous homeland has raged for over 100 years. And for most of it, or at least the early part of it, it was mostly localized during the middle part of the last century with the Arab League boycott, and then the Arab League taking steps against Jewish citizens in their countries, and then many of its members joining in with the local Palestinians or the Arabs of Palestine against Israel in the War of Independence. It became pretty much an Israel-Arab conflict. We saw further conflicts in 56 and 67 and 73, where not just, there were quite a few armies against Israel. And 79, we saw, the first sort of punctured hole in that. And we saw one of the big countries in the region, Egypt, forge peace with Israel. And there has been no conflict between Israel and Egypt since then. And then, as I said, in 1994 with Jordan. But as I said, these were agreements born out of necessity. They were actual conflicts. These two nations sit on Israel's border. These were born out of necessity. They were cold peace. The peace with Jordan is very much protected by the king and the royal family. It's not one that's popular amongst the people, especially when at least 2/3, if not more, of the population are Palestinian. In Egypt, it's deeply unpopular. But what we've seen now is we've seen 4 other countries, which makes it a total of 6 Arab countries out of 22 Arab League countries who are now have some sort of formal level of peace with Israel. So I think it's fair to say, and it's very, very possible that we'll see more and more countries. Saudi Arabia obviously are making moves towards Israel, allowing its planes to fly over. Our prime minister was in Saudi Arabia meeting with MBS a couple of weeks ago. So we can see Saudi Arabia not a million miles away. Prime Minister Netanyahu was in Oman in recent years, et cetera, et cetera. So it really does seem that the era of the Israel-Arab conflict is over. And what we've seen most tellingly, especially with this recent steps taken by Morocco, is that the Palestinians have understood that they are standing in the face of history. The interesting thing is when the UAE came out with recognition, Bahrain, even Sudan, there was a lot of outpouring of anger. There was a hostile communiques coming up from the Palestinian Authority. They worked very hard to make sure that their views that this was incorrect, that this was not in keeping with the Arab League initiative was known. Really some very hostile comments made, and in Palestinian society, a lot of outrage against these countries. The interesting thing is that after the Morocco communique or the understanding that there was going to be normalized ties, you heard almost nothing from the PA. And in fact, according to commentators in Israel, there was actually a signal sent out by the Palestinian leadership not to react in any way, shape, or form. There was not a tweet. There was not an official response. There was nothing from any of the Palestinian leadership, because it seems to me that they have now understood that there is something happening here. And by calling out these countries, by calling all sorts of names, traitors and all the rest of it, they're only harming their own relations with these countries. So what we see is the Palestinians have understood that this is happening, and this is going to continue happening, and they can't just spite themselves by coming out with these, outrageous statements against these countries, because these are countries which they need. They still need these countries for many, many different things, diplomatically, economically, etc. But what it does show is they understand that this is what's happening. The Israel-Arab, or let's just say the Arab line of resistance to Israel has been broken. The Arab League initiative is pretty much been rent asunder. And the Palestinians have understood now that the rules of the game are different. Just a few minutes, because it's very important to go into what's going on at the moment locally. It seems that this is the last week of this coalition. The debate now seems to be whether we're going to go for elections based on the lack of budget, which we talked about, will be most of the government or the Israeli political process thought that we had until Wednesday night, in other words, between Wednesday and Thursday. But now it seems that the Knesset legal advisors say we've got Tuesday night, Tuesday 12 o'clock, between Tuesday and Wednesday, which gives almost no time, not just to come up with a compromise, but also even to come up with a law to disperse the Knesset, which, as we discussed previously, would give Prime Minister Netanyahu a lot more of a free hand in deciding when elections would take place. And as we spoke about before, he would like them to be as further away as possible to give the atmosphere in the country a chance to improve with a mass vaccination program, which is going to start as of next week. Prime Minister Netanyahu himself has said that he will be the first person to be vaccinated, which is going to happen Saturday night, maybe even live. President as well, the chief of staff, the top medical people in the country are all going to be vaccinated, either live or publicly or whatever it is. There's a big drive at the moment on with that. But the fact remains that it seems to be at this point that the situation has spun out of control, certainly from the Prime Minister. It seems like even if they wanted a compromise, and it seems that Defense Minister Gantz and Netanyahu are looking for some compromise, even though apparently contacts are pretty much non-existent at this moment. Prime Minister Netanyahu is prepared to offer Gantz quite a lot, but he said he wants another exit point. This is what this whole political crisis has been about, giving Prime Minister Netanyahu an exit point that he can leave the government without having to hand over to Defense Minister Gantz the keys to Balfour House, to the house on Balfour, which is the Prime Minister's office. So basically, he wants another exit point, and which apparently is a non-starter with Gantz, he wants the resignation of Justice Minister Avi Nissenkorn, someone who's seen as very much in favor of judicial activism, something that the Likud and Prime Minister Netanyahu have claimed to be against, stood against for many years. But it seems like that's a non-starter. But as I said, even if they could work out some compromise, it doesn't seem like Gantz has much of a party to go back to. Already we've seen Derech Eretz, Hauser and Hendel, who have moved across to Gideon Saar's new party. Shasha Biton, who was the head of the Corona Committee in the Knesset, has also moved across to Gideon Saar's party. So it seems like even if there was some sort of compromise, A, the clock has almost run out, and B, I'm not sure if Netanyahu will be able to get a majority in the Knesset. But either way, it seems like next week is the crunch week, and if there is no compromise, if there is no law to disperse the Knesset, we go for elections 3 months from December 23rd. And with that, I'm happy to answer any questions on any of these issues or anything else.
All right, thank you so much. So the first question is, the internet is suggesting that 2 more Muslim countries are on the verge of opening embassies in Israel. The 2 likely candidates are allegedly Oman and Indonesia. If that is correct, can you comment on this?
I mean, we know Oman are not a million miles away. Prime Minister Netanyahu has visited Oman. It seems that there's quite a strong relationship there. Indonesia is a very interesting one because although it's not an Arab country, it's the most populous Muslim country. I spent a little bit of time there myself, and at the highest levels, they're certainly not hostile towards Israel, but in Indonesia, at least, there has been quite a growing Islamist movement. The president, Jokowi, has tried to present himself as more of a moderate Muslim leader over the years, but his opponents, Prabowo and some of the others, have tried to rouse the Islamist feeling in a country that used to be very tolerant and, basically sort of Southeast Asia version of Islam, which was more tolerant and open. They even have a word for it, which escapes me at the moment, but there has been a growing movement towards a more militant or more strict form of Islam over the years. So I think it would probably be welcome at the top level. They have quite good relations with Israel under the table, behind the scenes. And there has been some steps towards Israel in recent years with allowing a certain amount of visas to be presented to Israeli passport holders. But that would be a big coup if Indonesia would recognize and open relations with Israel. Oman would be nice. It would be another country. It's certainly not the most significant country in the region, but obviously any continuation of this momentum would be welcome. I'm sure those are two countries which are being looked at. There's probably a few others, but probably Oman is in the next level of those that could possibly normalize relations with Israel. But we've been surprised before, so one never knows what will come in the days ahead. And hopefully there will be more.
Okay, thank you so much. Do we know where at this time, where these embassies will be located?
I mean, we were asked that question before. I don't see any Arab or Muslim country opening an embassy in Jerusalem. I think that would just be too incendiary for some of their own publics and for the Palestinians. I'm assuming that they'll open where the vast majority of embassies in Israel are, in Tel Aviv or somewhere on the coast. I don't see any of them opening in Jerusalem at this point.
What do you think is the driving force for these peace deals, and does the U.S. government play an important role?
Absolutely. It plays a crucial role. In fact, I would say it plays the most crucial role. If you can see, I started saying before that these do seem like a different sort of level, different sort of warmth to the two agreements we've had for a few decades. But at the end of the day, each of these countries has gained something. UAE had their F-35s. Sudan has been taken off the list of terrorist groups. Morocco were basically had Western Sahara recognized as part of their territory by the US. Western Sahara is a territory, disputed territory. In fact, it's considered occupied territory by the United Nations, and very few countries in the world recognize it's part of Morocco. Morocco considers it part of its own territory, and the US basically recognized it as part of Morocco. So that was a major step. So each country has got something out of this deal. But I really think that there is that level, but there's also a level where, as I said, I think the concept of the Israel-Arab conflict is pretty much dissipated in many of these countries. They understand that they shouldn't allow their relations with another country be dictated by the Palestinians. They understand the Palestinians have been the victims of their own decisions over the years, and if they have to wait for them to have better relations with Israel, then they may never happen. And I think a lot of these countries are starting to understand Israel is not the enemy. Obviously, in the background to a lot of this is Iran. There is a mutual foe, an enemy in Iran. Iran is a threat to many of these countries, more so than Israel presents, certainly. So I think all of these factors are really enabling this process, but absolutely the US administration has been the driving force behind each of these normalization agreements.
And to follow up to that, if the Biden administration for some reason didn't follow through on Trump's promises to the Arab states, what is your best guess as to what they would do?
Well, it depends which. I mean, the Sudan one has already been done. They've been taken off the list. I'm not sure exactly how it works in the American system, whether it has to go through Congress or whether they need to, whether it could be put back so easily. I don't think. I mean, it would be a major step. As far as the F-35s, again, I'm not 100% sure on what exactly is going on. And the UAE has come out and said that even if there was some halt to that. They would still, keep up with the normalization, with the warm relations with Israel. It remains to be seen. Could Morocco rescind their recognition of Israel or recognition of former relations if the Biden administration unrecognizes Western Sahara? Again, it's always harder to put something back in when it was taken out. Like, would President-elect Biden recognize Jerusalem as Israel's capital? Probably not. But will he de-recognize it, if that is even a term? Unrecognize it? I doubt it. And he himself has said no. So I think once these decisions are made, it's a lot harder to go back on them. But the question remains is whether he will push forward with this sort of momentum and, try and see where else we can have more agreements with Israel, more recognition, more normalization. That remains to be seen, whether he'll then go back to the Obama era of sort of inside out, where focusing on the Palestinians and believing that is the route to peace in the Middle East, as opposed to the Trump administration, which is outward in. That remains to be seen, and I'm sure we'll find out in the weeks ahead.
Thank you. What may be the final disposition of the Palestinians with this somewhat normalization of relations with so many Middle East Arab states?
I mean, they're livid. They're extremely angry. They were promised that, according to the Arab League initiative, which was released at the beginning of the 2000s, beginning of this millennium, beginning of the century, that basically that no country, no Arab League country would have relations with Israel until the Palestinian issue was solved. In fact, it promised full relations with every Arab country once peace was agreed to with the Palestinians. So it put the Palestinian issue first and even gave the carrot of full relations with all these countries if and when the Palestinian issue should be resolved. What these countries are doing, whether they admit to it or not, is they are basically going against the Arab League initiative. A lot of these countries are coming out formally and saying we still stand to the vision of the Arab League initiative, but quite clearly they don't, because that central point is the central point, has basically been stood on its head. So the Palestinians feel that the Arab solidarity is weakening. They feel betrayed, and they understand that they're losing out with every normalization agreement.
Is there a potential problem with the Iranian intelligence agents operating in Shiite Bahrain?
In where?
Bahrain.
Sorry?
Bahrain.
I mean, most of the Arab world has a worry about what Iran is doing, and I don't think Bahrain, as being a majority Shiite country, certainly is one that is most worried. But these are countries which are worried about Iran on a day-to-day basis. They understand the destabilizing nature of Iran. They understand what Iran is trying to do. So they are all worried. Bahrain, no less than many of the other countries in the region, in the Gulf especially.
Moving on to the local elections. After the elections, is there anyone who would join a new government with Netanyahu as prime minister other than the ultra-Orthodox parties?
Well, like everything, it depends if you take these people at their words. Don't forget, we have a coalition now with Benny Gantz, a man who said throughout 3 elections that he would not sit with Prime Minister Netanyahu. So a lot of Israelis take these promises with a pinch of salt. Gideon Sa'ar has said on a few occasions since he created this party, New Hope, that he will not sit with Netanyahu. The Lieberman has said many times that he won't sit with Netanyahu. Lapid has said that. So the big question is Bennett. Bennett is the big wild card because Bennett has not said that. He has no great love or affection for Netanyahu, and it goes both ways. But he has not ruled out sitting with Netanyahu, and in fact, he will be crucial, although his numbers have certainly gone down since Sa'ar entered the race. In fact, he went from 22 in polls last week to now down to 13. And, those probably the vast majority of those votes went for Gideon Sa'ar. But still, if we do the numbers, Bennett will be an absolute crucial kingmaker, because if you add up what they could have expected to get with the ultra-Orthodox, they cannot possibly even hope to form a government without Bennett. The other side, the anti-Bibi sort of group, in fact, Victor Liebman has said, why don't we all run together? Or some sort of collaboration between Yeshua Beitenu, Yamina, Gideon Saar's party, Gantz and Lapid. Actually, I don't think he included Gantz, but in theory. And Gantz is getting very close to the electoral threshold. He went down to 5 seats in one poll. But together, they could potentially form a government. I think in the last poll, they got around 60 together. With Meretz, that would be up to 65. But the question is, could those parties sit with Meretz? But the fact is the numbers are getting very, very close. And as we said last week, it could come down to one vote here, one vote there. Again, these are polls. And until we have our elections being officially called, until we know who's running, these polls are nice, but they're relatively irrelevant because none of these figures will come true. And there'll be a lot of change. We already hear Gabi Ashkenazi is probably going to retire from politics, and who's going to join Saar and who's going to join this. And a lot of people are jockeying, even as we speak, in the Knesset to see which party they will join. We'll see more defections from Likud. We'll see probably Eisenkot coming into the race, maybe Ron Chaldei, the Tel Aviv mayor, perhaps in his own party, perhaps with someone else. So until we know exactly what these are, it'd be very, very difficult to know exactly what the map is going to look like. But it definitely, Prime Minister Netanyahu is going to be sweating a lot more this week, having seen Gideon Saar enter the ring. And what we have seen, I think that speaks to this, is the fact that they are now attacking Gideon Saar and kind of leaving Naftali Bennett's Yamina, who they've been attacking incessantly before that, because they know that the day after, they will probably have to run to Bennett and see what deal can be made. And that's probably the only chance that Netanyahu has of forming the next government.
Understood. Will the joint list continue to oppose the normalization process? And is there a chance they will participate by creating political alliances in the Knesset more fully in the future?
The joint list, again, the joint list is 3 parties. There's the Arab Nationalist Party, you have the Communist Party, which also has some Jewish members, and you have the Islamist list run by Mansour Abbas, the Ram Party, which has actually been cozying up, if you will, to Netanyahu recently, and have been developing a new strategy to, sort of quid pro quo. If we get some of the things for our communities, then we can certainly see ourselves siding with you on certain issues. So that, by the way, that could actually be crucial. As I said, 1 seat here, one vote here, one vote there. Even in the next few days on when the elections can be held, Mansour Abbas and his, I think there's 3 other people in his party on the joint list, those votes could be absolutely crucial for Netanyahu in the days ahead, and certainly after the next elections. So having 4 people abstain from the opposition could allow Netanyahu not to have to reach 61, maybe he could even have 58 or something like this. Again, these numbers are very important, and there's no coincidence that these things are happening now when every single vote counts. In fact, the Likud are trying to get Shasha Biton out of the Likud list because she's already said she's joining Gideon Saar's list in the next elections, but she still remains a Likud member. And Miki Zohar, who's the coalition chairman, is trying to basically chuck her out of the Knesset because every vote will count over the next few days. So the Arab list is not united at this point. They probably will run together. Again, there's also moves, although I doubt we'll have time, to lower the threshold, the electoral threshold, back to something remarkably low as 1.5%, which our lists could actually run separately again. But I think that now there's probably too little time to pass that sort of legislation at this point.
Thank you. And what is the status of the Israeli projects at IBI and Migal to develop COVID-19 vaccines?
Well, they're now in human trials. I believe they just finished now in stage 2. They're expected to hopefully be releasing the actual vaccine by the summer. There are a lot of questions in Israel about whether there is a need to continue. In fact, there are some senior health ministry officials who have called for this whole local domestic clinical trials to stop. Their point is it's a bit of a waste of money because we are getting all these international vaccines. We're going to have, I believe, 8 million Pfizer vaccines by the end of March. We're going to have 4 million over the next couple of months, and then another batch of 4 million in March, I believe. And then we've also got deals with Moderna and a few others. So there are those in the health ministry who are basically calling for the end of the trials in Israel, because they said by the time they come out with their vaccine, everyone who wants to will already be vaccinated. But I think they're going to carry on. It's a different type of vaccine. It's a more traditional vaccine as opposed to the RIs and Moderna putting out. So I think there's also some national pride there, and also it's useful to have your own domestic vaccine. And it's possible that we will need an annual vaccine, so it's helpful to have something more domestically created. So I don't see it being stopped, even though there are voices in the health ministry against the continuation of these.
All right, well, thank you so much. We've come to the close of our webinar. Thank you, Ashley, again, for taking time to update us this week. And for our viewers, please join us Friday at 1 p.m. Eastern for a webinar with Winfield Myers updating us on Campus Watch. Thank you all for joining us, and I hope you have a great day.